This is the Facts on JW. I'm Casey, your host, and today I have a special series for you. I call it
JW True Crime.
A true crime series told through the lens of lived experience. Here we examine real cases involving power, control, image, and you named it, belief. Especially where high control religion intersects with silence, shame, and accountability. This series is not about attacking faith. It's not about attacking Jehovah's Witnesses. It's about asking the questions victims were never allowed to ask. We don't sensationalize, we don't excuse, and we don't look away. Because understanding how harm happens is the first step toward preventing it. So today we have a story about a former Jehovah's Witness. He was a Jehovah's Witness. He believed in it. You may have heard of the story of Chris Watts, a family man, a wife, 2 little girls, annihilated his entire family back in 2018. Well, long before the story of Chris Watts, there was another Chris, Christian Longo. Some men don't fall apart loudly. They collapse quietly, behind closed doors, behind smiles, behind belief. Christian Longo wasn't living on the margins of society. He wasn't hiding in plain sight because he looked dangerous. He looked normal. He looked trustworthy. He looked like a family man, like Chris Watts. And at times, he identified himself as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Tonight we're going to be talking about Christian Longo, not just what he did, but how he lived, what he hid, and why his story feels disturbingly familiar to many former Jehovah's Witnesses. We're not blaming Jehovah's Witness religion or any religion. This is about understanding image, control, shame, and the cost of silence. Going back to his beginnings, Christian Michael Longo was born on January 23, 1974, and was raised in Michigan in a Jehovah's Witness household. His mother and stepfather were Jehovah's Witnesses. Religion wasn't optional. Being one of Jehovah's Witnesses wasn't optional. It shaped his daily life, identity, and expectations. Christian became one of Jehovah's Witnesses as a teenager, and to those of us who grew up inside high control belief system, this pattern is recognizable. Being one of us creates trust. It grants moral credibility even when none is earned. In 1993, Christian Longo married Mary Jane Baker. He was only 19 years old and Mary Jane was 26. They met through the Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. And at only 19 years old, Christian was suddenly expected to be a husband, a provider, and a spiritual head. Before he had stability, before he had a career, before he had matured, he was supposed to be all of these things. You don't even know who you are at 19, let alone a husband, a provider, and a spiritual head. It can be overwhelming, especially in a high control religious group, where the man is expected to provide and be a spiritual head. Mary Jane, by contrast, though, was older and more established. From the outside, they looked like a proper witness couple. Nobody would know what kind of problems were going on inside. The foundation was fragile. Over the next several years, they had 3 children, Zachary, Sadie, and Madison. By December of 2001, their children were 4, 3, and 2 years old. 3 very young children, 3 lives completely dependent on adults. And behind the scenes, Christian Longo was failing, financially and emotionally. But failure wasn't something he knew how to admit. He struggled to hold steady employment. Instead of telling the truth, he fabricated success. He lied about jobs, wrote bad checks, committed check fraud, and accumulated massive debt. Eventually, authorities charged him with fraud in Michigan. He didn't take responsibility. He ran. He moved his family again and again, from Michigan to California to Oregon. Even each move sold as a fresh start. But it was never a fresh start. It was avoidance. He was running from his problems. And if that wasn't enough, he also had committed adultery on his wife. Christian's lies didn't stay hidden forever. Local newspapers reported his fraud, and then when the congregation elders became aware, they responded as Jehovah's Witness elders would do, and he was disfellowshipped. That means he was formally shunned, expelled, and cut off socially and spiritually from any of his friends and family that were Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, at the same time, he had also been unfaithful to his wife after Mary Jane discovered some emails showing that he had been unfaithful to her. And in turn, the congregation disciplined him for it. But Mary Jane forgave him and stayed with him. She endured public shame, isolation, and loss of community. So by 2001, he was disfellowshipped, financially ruined, exposed, and losing control, and facing consequences he could no longer escape. He didn't show remorse during this period. What he showed was panic at exposure. For men who live by image, accountability feels like annihilation. Shame feels unbearable. Control becomes everything. Religion did not restrain him. It was simply another mask. And when the mask shattered, he chose erasure. By 2001, Christian Longo had murdered his wife, Mary Jane, in their home. Evidence showed this was intentional, and evidence showed that she was most likely strangled. After he murdered his wife, he then goes to murder his 3 children. He then transported their bodies separately and disposed of them in different locations. This was not impulsive, it was planned. After killing his entire family, he didn't seek help. He packed his belongings and he fled. Where did he go? He went off to Mexico. And even then, after everything, he continued the same. He reinvented himself. He assumed the identity of a real person named Michael Finkle, a journalist and writer. Using Finkle's name, Longo claimed to be a writer himself. He charmed people, he told stories, he performed. He needed admiration, validation, and audience, even after murder. After his arrest, Christian Longo contacted the real Michael Finkle from prison. Why? Because even incarcerated, he needed to be heard, to be important, to shape the narrative. This wasn't remorse. This was narcissism without boundaries. Longo didn't lose control of his life. He lost control of the story and couldn't accept it. This story isn't about religion creating a murderer. It's about what happens when image replaces integrity. Control replaces accountability. Silence replaces truth. Christian Longo didn't believe deeply enough to stop himself. He believed in himself, and the people who paid the price were his family: Mary, Zachary, Sadie, and Madison. They deserve to be remembered as lives, not just victims. And if you're watching this as a former Jehovah's Witness and feeling something stir, you're not imagining it. Control cultures don't create monsters, but they can help hide them. And this is the problem with high control religious groups, is it's all about the image and the stress. The people are very stressed inside controlling religions, and they need an outlet. And for some people, it makes them lose their sanity. Now let's hear from This Is Monsters. they covered this story several years ago about Christian Longo, and I'm just going to kind of do a little reaction video to this and show you some of their stuff on here is really good, so I will leave in the description below the name of this particular channel. So his stepfather, he apparently was not born in as a Jehovah's Witness. His family converted when he was little. When he was like 4, he had a younger brother, and his stepfather became a Jehovah's Witness. His mother was actually originally Roman Catholic, and the Jehovah's Witnesses came to their door and they converted when Chris was very little.
Which is what they called going door to door, proselytizing. Joy would take Chris and Dustin with her when she went door to door, and Chris took to the material very well. At the organization, they taught their followers.
Now here he calls it the organization, but obviously we know it's just Jehovah's Witness organization. But most Jehovah's Witnesses don't call it the organization necessarily. They might call it the truth or the friends or the branch or the governing body says such and such. So anyways.
How to talk to people and how to answer the questions that were bound to arise. This is something that seemed to prepare Chris for his future life as a con artist. One of the most negative aspects of the Jehovah's Witness religion is their insistence that their members don't mingle with non-members.
Yeah, so you can see here, no dress coat, a man, no dress coat, worldly hairstyle, casual appearance, which is kind of funny because that's what they used to say about men not having a dress coat, but yet now it's deemed okay. And of course, men can have beards. Now they do want you to dress modestly, but also, as he said here, worldly. You know, if you aren't in the truth, everyone else is worldly. And it gives you a sense of trust, that you can trust everyone that is in the organization. You can trust them. That is also the problem with the organization, with Jehovah's Witness organization, is because you feel you can trust them. I mean, I know myself, I felt that I could trust people in the truth, not people in the world. The people in the world could not be trusted. And because of this, that can create problems where crime happens, because you have this sense of trust. And people who are in the organization or in the truth, who may have ulterior motives, know this. And they know it, and they know that who witness rule, hence the reason why child SA is a problem, because how many witnesses are there going to be? And the other is scamming, because if you think you can trust your brother or sister to, maybe you want to get a loan from them. Oh, and you know, they'll let me pay them back over time. Maybe you don't pay them back. That's the problem. It's that sense of false trust.
If you're a Jehovah's Witness, you're only supposed to hang out with other Jehovah's Witnesses. If your own child decides to stop being a Jehovah's Witness, then you're supposed to cut off all contact with them.
Exactly. Well, there you have the shunning, of course.
Like Scientologists won't hang out with people who are quote-unquote repressives, Jehovah's Witnesses won't hang out with people who are quote-unquote worldly, which is insane that they use.
Of course, he says worldly, but it's actually disfellowshipped. You don't hang out with disfellowshipped ones at all. And worldly ones, you keep arm length. You keep them at arm's length, which makes it a cult.
With people who have been out in the world and have experienced life. In order to believe in their religion, you need to stay away from those types of people. Interesting. At the beginning of the 1990s, Joe was transferred to be the regional manager of the retail chain in Michigan. They moved to the town of Ypsilanti, about 20 minutes east of Ann Arbor. From this point on in his life, Chris was homeschooled instead of going to public school. Throughout his later teen years, he held a few part-time jobs and did his schoolwork at home and continued his work for the organization. Mary Jane Baker was born on April 25, 1967, in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She was the middle of 5 children. Mary Jane's parents, Jim and Susan, were not originally Jehovah's Witnesses either. Around 1973, Jim and Susan divorced, and Susan became a Jehovah's Witness. Jim had rejected the religion, but it's unclear if that had anything to do with their separation. As Mary Jane grew older and got out of high school, she started working as a secretary at a dental school at the University of Michigan. She wanted to get married, but Jehovah's Witnesses were not supposed to marry outside of their religion.
Right, so she ends up marrying Chris. He was only 19, and she was 26.
When the Longos moved to the area, they brought her her best prospect in Chris. When Chris found out that Mary Jane was interested in dating him, he immediately reciprocated. Except his parents didn't think he was ready to date.
They gave me an ultimatum at that point. They said I was still fairly adamant that I wanted to date Mary Jane, and they essentially said you can either live under our roof or you can date Mary Jane. And I chose to move out that next week. 18 plus 1 week and a half or so.
Even though Chris was now 18 years old, they believed that he was still too immature to date. They told
Yeah, he was immature, but I just find it ridiculous that Jehovah's Witness parents want to kick their kids out just for dating someone they don't agree with. And in this case, she was a Jehovah's Witness and she was older. But see, they push that, well, if you're going to date, you got to get married right away. So that's the other problem.
Told him that he could either live under their roof or date Mary Jane. So Chris, being a young man in love, packed his bags and moved out. This young man had been sheltered from the real world, never faced any real problems on his own, had only ever been educated within a small bubble of the organization, and now he was out on his own. Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in team sports, after-school activities, or higher education.
Okay, team sports, it's not to say that they don't believe in that, it's to say they discourage it. They discourage it because it takes away from your meeting attendance and your field service. If you have any activities after school, well, that could interfere with meeting time. So that's the reason. Also because of the bad association, worldly people. And as we all know, higher education is now okay with certain criteria, like you probably can't stay in a dorm. You can only choose specific topics to study. So they are still kind of trying to throw in some control on that. Higher education, I would say, they're really not for it, but they are pretending to please the masses and try to gain control of the organization so that they can keep up with their charitable status.
Anything that could give a young adult some type of skills to use when they live on their own were not approved by the organization. His parents, who believed he was too immature to date, had created a situation where he was dating and living on his own. Good job. Chris stayed with a friend for a few weeks until he was able to get an apartment with a couple of roommates. 5 months later, during a group trip to the Jehovah's Witness headquarters in Brooklyn, New York, Chris managed to get Mary Jane alone at the hotel restaurant where he gave her a diamond ring and asked her to marry him. She said yes. Chris's life of crime began just 3 months after the engagement. He worked at a camera shop in the local mall, and he wasn't making enough to pay his portion of the rent, plus the payment for the engagement ring that he had purchased on credit. One day, a man had come into the camera shop and put a $108 down payment on a camcorder, and Chris decided to pocket the money. He took that money to the jewelry store in the same mall and made a payment on Mary Jane's ring. The following day, Chris was scheduled to open the store. He went in, placed his keys, a check for $108, and a resignation letter onto the counter. Then he locked up and left. That didn't get him completely off the hook, though. His boss pressed charges, and Chris was convicted of misdemeanor embezzlement. He received 80 hours of community service.
So the problem here, I think, with Chris is he must be criminally minded, first of all. But secondly, he lived very sheltered life. I mean, he was homeschooled. and then he was surrounded by just Jehovah's Witnesses, and then he marries a Jehovah's Witness, and he has no skills, and he has no money, so he starts stealing, because he probably feels like he doesn't know what else to do.
He explained what he had done to Mary Jane. She forgave him and told him she still wanted to marry him. He promised that he would never do anything like that or lie to her ever again.
Hello, ladies. Red flag number 1. Don't marry a criminal. I don't care if he stole $100, like this guy. Which back then in the early 90s might have, equaled to more than that, for sure. But regardless, it's the principle. If he steals a little bit of money, it's just the beginning. What else is he going to do? As you'll see.
Again, that would be one of the biggest lies that Chris would ever tell, and he went on to tell a lot of lies. Chris told the organization about what happened, and he was put on restrictions. This is another idea that's common in multiple religions.
So restrictions would be, most likely he was reproved. So, in other words, for those who don't know, he would have had, it could have been public or private. Most likely was public because too many people, he knew about his crime spree there. But that doesn't mean shunning. It just means they go up on stage, say, Christian Longo has been reproved. And that's all you're told. But in turn, it also means that you have no privileges in the congregation. So what, in my opinion? But people can still talk to you. And you have to work your way back into getting privileges again with time and after they counsel you for a while and maybe study with you.
If you do something that's against the religion's teachings, you get restricted from certain privileges available to members who are in good standing. It meant that Chris would not be allowed to marry in their kingdom hall, something that was a very big deal to Mary Jane. Chris worried.
Let me tell you, getting married in the kingdom hall, just about nobody gets a chance to do that because no one ever is good enough to get married in the kingdom hall.
That his indiscretion may have ruined his relationship, but ultimately, Mary Jane agreed that their relationship was more important than where they got married. Chris and Mary Jane got married on March 13, 1993. Chris's parents, though they originally were not supportive of the union, paid for the pair to honeymoon in Jamaica. Chris began working for Publishers Circulation Fulfillment, which was a company that handled the delivery of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. The pay was decent, and he worked the early morning hours, which meant he had the rest of the day to spend with Mary Jane. After their wedding, the couple rented an apartment together, and the property owners recalled Chris telling them that he worked for the New York Times. It wasn't an outright lie, but it was twisting the truth. He was essentially a paperboy, but I work for the New York Times sounds so much more prestigious. That kind of thing mattered to Chris. Throughout the 1990s, Chris continued to get himself into minor financial trouble. He had been sued for failing to pay his landlord from his previous apartment. He got a retail charge card in his and Mary Jane's name and failed to pay the over $1,400 balance. Even though both Chris and Mary Jane were working, they still seemed to spend above their means. Family members questioned how they were able to afford everything. Chris always wanted the best of everything. He viewed himself as a photographer, so he spent money on camera equipment. He had a new computer, which was not cheap in the mid-90s. They took several vacations to Jamaica and Mexico. Their first child, a son named Zachary, was born on February 28, 1997. Chris was promoted at the distribution company and used the extra money to buy a new car and a pool table. That pool table went into the new house they purchased from Mary Jane's mother and stepfather. That house was purchased because the Longos had another baby on the way. Sadie was born on April 30th, 1998.
Okay, I'm actually surprised they had so many kids because we were told, especially in the 90s, early 90s, that the end was going to happen soon. This generation of 1914 shall not pass away. They were believing Jehovah's Witnesses. And they probably thought that the generation of 1914, they were old. They were dying off. So why have children? I don't get it.
After being in San Francisco, away from his family for a week, the distribution company decided to pull some of the managers and send them back home. When Chris found out that he was going to be one of the managers that stayed in the Bay Area, he up and quit. He had had enough of the company keeping him away from his family, and he vowed that he would not miss Sadie's first steps and first word.
Hello, why don't you just have your whole family move there? Huh? That would have made sense. That way you would have a job at least.
Like he did with Zach. At least, that was Chris's explanation. Chris began working as a salesman for a fireplace and spa company. He would sell fireplaces to the local construction companies. It didn't pay as well as his previous job, but he was able to spend more time with his family. Chris eventually learned that his pay, which was straight commission, would not be as high as he was promised when he took the job. That didn't stop the family from overspending, though. In 1998, the Longos had taken out a loan with a local credit union to buy a 1997 Sea-Doo Bombardier jet ski, and Chris financed a brand new Dodge Durango.
Okay, if y'all are struggling financially, why are you getting a Sea-Doo and a brand new Dodge Durango, huh? Get a used car and don't get a boat, for goodness sakes. And I don't understand, like, what is with both of them? Like, why were they not good with money? It's like they needed to be educated on that.
On top of that, Mary Jane was pregnant with their third child.
Ooh,
Madison was born on October 19, 1999. She was 7 weeks premature and had respiratory issues that required her to stay in the hospital for about a month. This put a financial strain on the family because even though they had health insurance, it didn't cover everything. You know, America. It also didn't help that they had not changed their spending habits when Chris began working his new job with a lower income. While Madison was still in the hospital, Mary Jane's car was repossessed. She had been allocating their available funds to ensure that Chris's car payment got made since his job required the use of a vehicle. Of course, out of anything, Chris was most upset that their neighbors might have seen their car get repossessed. Appearances were always the most important thing to Chris.
of course.
Chris knew that his sales job was not going to get them out of debt. He needed to find something he could do to bring in enough money, and he saw an opportunity in the construction industry. In January of 2000, Chris started his own business, Final Touch Construction Cleaning. The company began landing contracts immediately. Contractors that Chris had already known from his sales job were giving him more work than he could do. He hired an employee, and then he hired several employees. The company was thriving, and they were billing out thousands of dollars in work, but it wasn't coming in. In the construction industry, contractors are not quick to pay their subcontractors. They will, it's just a long process and takes some time. Chris needed cash now to pay his employees. Not only that, but his Dodge Durango broke down and needed thousands of dollars in repairs. Since he started the business, he bragged about how much money they were making, so as far as Mary Jane knew, they were rolling in it. The truth was, they were just as broke as they were before.
How does this woman not know about their finances? That's something I don't understand with couples. Like, if you have a joint account, maybe they didn't, but if you have a joint account, you'd think that she would know how much money is coming in and going out. So it's almost like she was just ignorant to what was going on.
But Chris already knew what he needed to do. One of the things that Chris had always afforded himself was the nicest computer equipment, so even in 2000, he had a scanner and printer capable of creating a fake driver's license. At least one that could pass for real at a car dealership. Chris scanned his own driver's license, edited the information, and printed out the new license. He then laminated the license and cut it out to be the correct size.
Aha. All in, so you could get a free car under a fake ID.
The only thing it was missing was the little holographic state seal, but that was easily overlooked. Chris drove into Ohio and returned the rental car he had been driving to a location near a group of car dealerships. He then walked into a dealership and asked to test drive a new Pontiac Montana minivan, fully loaded. The saleswoman asked to take a photocopy of his driver's license, so he handed over his Michigan driver's license that said Jason Fortner, and she walked away. When she returned, she handed him back his license and the keys to the van. Chris hopped in the van and drove off the lot. He never returned.
He just stole that car. He's supposed to be a Jehovah's Witness, and following the rules. Didn't seem like he was able to ever.
When he got home, Mary Jane was thrilled with her new vehicle. Chris explained that the dealership had a special deal where payments didn't start for 90 days. That was more than enough time for Final Touch to be raking in the money. Chris had taken the license plate off of his Durango while it was still out of commission and placed it on the Montana. He then ordered vanity plates for his Durango that said Kid Van, and when they arrived, he placed them on the Montana and put the Durango's plates back on the truck. In Michigan, a vanity plate didn't list the type of vehicle it was on, just who the registered owner was. If someone ran the plates on the minivan, it would just come up as registered to Chris Longo. The only evidence left behind was a photocopy of the fake driver's license. Jason Fortner wasn't real, and the address didn't exist. The police in Ohio didn't have much to go on, and unless someone physically found the van and could match the VIN, they were out of luck. It seemed that Chris's problem was that he wanted too much too fast. When Joe and Joy moved to Indianapolis, Chris convinced Joe to invest in opening an Indianapolis branch of Final Touch. The business was in demand, and his contracts were finally rolling into regular pay cycles, but Chris impatiently wanted more and more, and he kept himself underwater.
Sounds like he was greedy and, like they were saying, impatient, wanting more and more, couldn't get enough, and then spin, spin, spin. How are you ever supposed to get your head above water if you keep spending? And then, in order to keep up with your lifestyle, well, you steal, you scam, you write bad checks, you steal cars.
Christian Longo would eventually go on to talk extensively with a journalist named Michael Finkle, and in his correspondence, he makes himself out to be justified in all of his actions. He paints himself as a guy who was backed into a corner and just made some bad decisions in an effort to keep everyone happy, but
he's a liar. And then this whole pretending to be Michael Finkle, it was for attention. That's all it was.
that doesn't seem to be true. 2 months after starting Final Touch, Chris opened a separate business checking account that nobody else knew about. He used that account to purchase a forklift and a trailer, but the check bounced. Chris eventually sold that same equipment for $5,000. He wrote himself a check for $5,900 and cashed it at a local credit union. That check also bounced. When the people that Chris bought the forklift and trailer from reported the equipment stolen, Chris claimed that it had been totaled in a car accident. This was a complete fabrication, and it's hard to understand how Chris would do something like that as a means of just trying to get by during hard times.
Yeah, this guy was definitely spiraling out of control here. He was terrible with money, and he was making bad decisions left and right.
Chris continued to use his history of blaming everyone else for his problems.
Sounds like a typical narcissist to me. Most narcissists blame other people for their own mistakes.
His biggest accounts was held by Wexford Builders, and they owed him quite a few $1,000s. He began believing that, if they had paid their invoices on time, he wouldn't be in this mess. Chris used his computer forgery skills to recreate the checks that he had received previously from Wexford Builders, and printed 6 checks for different amounts, all matching unpaid invoices he had sent the company, according to Chris. The next day, he deposited 3 checks into his bank account and experienced no issues, so he deposited a few more the day after. Chris had enough money in his account to cover his payroll so he wouldn't look like a failure to everyone. His employees, his parents, his family. That was Chris's biggest priority. He had no concern of getting caught. He once wrote, quote, "All I could think of right now was that today's problem was solved," end quote. That's called short-sightedness, when you only think about what's happening today, but not about how it will affect the future.
Right, which makes him a narcissist.
His lack of foresight made it easy for police to track Chris down and question him about his
This guy's an idiot.
forgeries. On July 14, 2000, Detective Sergeant Fred Farkas brought Chris into the police station and questioned him about the forgeries. Chris tried to chalk it up to a business mistake, but the authorities explained that check forgery was a serious offense and each forged check could have up to a 14-year prison sentence. Chris openly admitted that he had cashed the checks at the bank and that he knew that they weren't valid checks. He claimed that he had only cashed the checks in the amounts that Wexford Builders owed him, but the investigators had already talked to the home builder, and they said that they didn't owe Chris nearly as much as he had stolen from them. At the time of Chris's last attempted forgery, which was unsuccessful, that would have added up to about $35,000. Authorities were mostly interested in obtaining the equipment he used to create the checks. This was the first time in this encounter that Chris refused to cooperate. It wasn't until Detective Farkas told him that he was going to get a search warrant for his home, his vehicles, and his bank account that he changed his mind. Chris didn't want the police looking into his life any harder. They could discover that the minivan was stolen. They could discover that he had written bad checks to other banks, some of his employees, or for the purchase of the forklift and trailer. They could discover that most of his toys, like his jet skis and his boat, were all actually stolen. Not directly by Chris, but he got a real good deal on them. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Chris told them that the laptop he had used to create the checks was in the Durango. Mary Jane drove the truck down to the police station and paid a $100 bond for Chris to be released. Though Chris avoided being taken to jail that night, his punishment wasn't over. Detective Farkas was continuing to gather evidence to officially charge Chris, and at the same time, the organization was coming to a decision about Chris's worthiness to remain a member. Just months earlier, Chris had been caught having an affair with another witness member who he had hired to be his assistant. Though both Chris and the other woman claimed that they never had a physical relationship, their emotional affair was still grounds for restrictions within the community.
Okay. I don't think that's true, because if you have had an emotional affair, you can't get disfellowshipped for that. It has to be physical, as far as I know. Maybe reprimanded, maybe counseled, but not disfellowshipped. So there's a possibility that he was cheating on her anyways.
Chris would have been able to regain his standing in the organization through repentance, but this new information about the forgeries proved that Chris was not willing to repent for his actions, and the Jehovah's Witnesses disfellowshipped Chris. This can also be referred to as a shunning, because, well, that's exactly what it is.
Right.
Active members in the organization were to sever all ties with someone who was shunned. But Mary Jane was married to Chris. How was she supposed to do that?
Oh, well, you don't shun your spouse. That's the only person you don't shun. But it's really a weird situation, because it depends on what you're being shunned for. If it's apostasy, then a lot of times the elders will encourage you to separate and have no contact. If it's for something else, like fraud or adultery, and you work things out, then yes, you do talk to each other in home. But it would just be for the spouses and anyone in the home. Anyone else living in your home, you're supposed to keep it to a very minimum conversations. Silly.
She continued to attend regular meetings, but the situation put a major strain on her life. Chris's own mother, stepfather, and brother all shunned him. Joe removed himself from the business and asked for his investment to be returned. Chris eventually pleaded guilty to 2 counts of forgery and 2 counts of uttering and publishing. He was sentenced to 3 years of probation, fines covering court costs, and $29,868 in restitution. Chris had gotten a slap on the wrist for this offense, but the heat was not off. Detective Farkas had found out about Chris's other bad checks and about the larceny case that was pending in the next county over regarding the forklift and trailer. The prosecutor issued a new arrest warrant for the scam involving the forklift and trailer. Employees that had received bad checks from Chris were starting to file lawsuits. Chris's probation officer seemed to not care too much about what Chris did, but the walls were still closing in. By the spring of 2001, Chris had used up the $100,000 line of credit he had gotten when he opened his business. The same line of credit that his mother and stepfather had signed for. On top of the $30,000 in restitution Chris was ordered to pay by the court, he still owed employees and other banks $74,000. To ease the pressure, Chris did what Chris did best, and forged Joe's signature to secure a credit card, which he used for a few months. But instead of using the money to get himself into a better position financially, he bought scuba gear and paid for diving lessons. He also got laser eye surgery for Mary Jane. One of his last few employees fell off of a roof and broke both of his ankles, but Chris hadn't been paying his workers' compensation insurance. The employee sued. When the credit card reached its limit, Chris tried to get another one, but by then, his parents had found out about the first one. They began working with the credit card company to bring charges against their son. In order to solve all of these problems, Chris and Mary Jane quietly sold their house, loaded everything they needed into the Montana minivan and a rented trailer, and disappeared.
Why is Mary staying with this man? I mean, he is ruining them financially, and he's not going to stop. He's just, a credit card? Max it out. All right, next. I mean, this guy is crazy. She should have left him.
Chris had found an old warehouse for rent for about $1,700 a month in Toledo, Ohio, and believed that the family could live there while he started a new business, and got the money together to get a house. Chris told Mary Jane not to tell anyone where they were going, not even family members. There were always questions as to whether or not Mary Jane was involved in Chris's scams. It seems unlikely she wouldn't be involved, as it was impossible for her to not know what was going on. The thing that defined Mary Jane the most was her faith in the Jehovah's Witness religion. It teaches young women that their purpose is to support and obey their husbands. All Jehovah's Witness couples are encouraged to read a book created by the organization called The Secret of Family Happiness. In it, there's a section called Wifely Subjection, which describes what qualities a wife should display in her relationship with her husband. It explains that God created Eve as a helper to Adam, a complement, not a competitor. It states, quote, "The husband was to exercise loving headship, and the wife was to manifest love, respect, and willing submission," end quote. The book goes on to say, quote, "However, a good wife is more than just submissive. She tries to be a real helper, being supportive of her husband in the decisions that he makes. Of course, that is easier for her when she agrees with his decisions. But
Yeah, see, that's a major problem right there, and maybe that's why she didn't leave him, is the women are taught to be in subjection to their husbands and to be submissive to them and to have deep respect, even when they don't deserve it. They're not respectful to you. Why would you be respectful to them? And that's the problem right there. If the women like her should have left him, she may be alive today. But instead, she stayed with him, let him ruin them financially, and all the while he's disfellowshipped. So he's not a good spiritual head at this point, according to Jehovah's Witnesses, of course. But because she married him, you're stuck unless he cheats on you. If you forgive him like she did, if he did cheat on her and she forgave him, poof, you start over. You can't divorce now. It would have to be another incident of cheating. It's just weird to me that she would stay with him.
Even when she does not, her active support can help his decision to have a more successful outcome," end quote. It's impossible to say what was going on in Mary Jane's head because we can't ask her, but it's entirely possible that she believed that she needed to support her husband no matter what. And it's...
Yes, that's true. And I have seen cases where submissive wives in the Jehovah's Witness religion would stay in abusive situations, whether they be physical, emotional, or mental or verbal abuse, or financial in this case. They stay because they're told they're supposed to. So that could be the reason why she stayed.
Seems that Chris knew that. Some of his employees would later say that they overheard him talking about being able to do whatever he wanted and that Mary Jane would never leave him.
Yeah, so what's going to stop him from cheating on her again? And apparently, if she finds out about it, she just forgives him.
Chris had managed to talk the landlord of the warehouse into only taking 1 month's rent as a deposit. She was so anxious to rent out the building that she didn't even bother with a credit check. Once there, Chris began using a new bank account to cash more forged checks. He began using the names of other builders he had worked for to cash checks into his account, and then he took a portion of the deposit back in cash. Chris still used his own name and made no effort to not get caught. He just brazenly scammed cash wherever he could. Detective Farkas was immediately informed that Chris had fled and that he was forging more checks. Police had heard rumors that the Longos had gone to Toledo, but they didn't know exactly where. Chris had started his new business at the warehouse, which happened to be selling stolen goods. He put an ad in the local paper advertising a skid loader for sale. When a man came out to look at it, he became suspicious when Chris offered to sell him a $30,000 piece of equipment for $5,000. He notified the police, and Sergeant Paul Hickey took a few other officers out to the warehouse to check it out. Chris used his charm to explain that he had purchased the skid loader a year prior for his business, but never ended up needing it. He said that he didn't have the title and registration with him as they were in the process of moving, but he would dig it up and fax it to him later that day. Sergeant Hickey radioed in the serial number of the equipment, and the dispatch responded that it had not been reported stolen. After talking to both Chris and Mary Jane and not feeling like either of them were acting strangely, Sergeant Hickey left and went back to the station. Out of curiosity, he had the serial number of the skid loader traced to a dealer, and the dealer put him in contact with who their records said they sold it to. When he called that company, which was located in Ypsilanti, they told him that the skid loader had gone missing about 2 months prior, but they had never reported it stolen. Sergeant Hickey gathered the troops and raced back out to the warehouse, but the Longos were gone. In the warehouse, they found a large trailer, a boat, and a boat trailer. They were all reported stolen. The Longos drove across the country, sleeping in a tent most of the time and using the last bits of the money that Chris had gotten from...
They're sleeping in a tent? What in the world? Why? Why would you stay with this man? Especially when you have 3 little kids. I mean, you could go live with your parents. That would be better than living in a tent. 3 kids.
Forged checks and selling stolen property. It's unclear exactly where they went, but on September 12, 2001, they ended up at the Pacific Coast in a small town in Oregon called Yachats. Yachats is about dead center on the Oregon coast, not too far south of Newport, a pretty popular summer beach spot. Chris and his family went to the office of Ocean Odyssey Vacation Rentals and negotiated a weekly rental of a 3-bedroom home for a $200 deposit and $190 a week. When the agent asked for a credit card, Chris admitted that his cards were all maxed out and said he was hoping that he could just pay in cash. Seeing that the family was obviously worn out from their travels, the agent agreed and the Longos headed off to their new home just a few miles up the coast in Waldport. It didn't last long as Chris couldn't afford the weekly payment and they were kicked out of the home after less than a month. They managed to find shelter at a small motel in Newport for the time being, while Chris tried to bring in some money. Some people believe that Chris made a deal with Mary Jane to start earning an honest living, and that's why Mary Jane continued to put up with the lifestyle that Chris had condemned them to.
Yes, that's possible. But she should have seen by now that that wasn't happening. I mean, if they're living in a tent and you find out that your husband's stolen equipment and he hasn't changed in the 8 years that they were together, he's not going to.
There's no way to know for sure, but Chris did attempt to do honest work after they arrived in Oregon. Chris knew that he couldn't try to get a job that would do a background check because that would reveal his criminal record and pending warrants. He didn't have any real skills besides being a convincing personality. He went down the street to a Starbucks coffee shop that was located inside a Fred Meyer retailer and applied for a job. He had no experience, but he charmed his way into the position. He managed to convince the manager of the Landing condominiums to rent him a 1-bedroom unit for $1,200 a month, something that Chris knew he could not afford. But remember, Chris was not someone to worry about tomorrow's problems. He found them an upgrade from their motel room for now, and that's all that mattered. It wasn't long, though, before Chris came to the conclusion that it was his own family that was costing him the most. If he didn't have to pay for them, he could be living it up. Sometime between getting off work on November 16th and the morning of November 17th, Chris Longo strangled 34-year-old Mary Jane and 2-year-old Madison and stuffed their bodies into suitcases. He carried the suitcases from the condo across the street to the Embarcadero Marina and dropped them into the water.
So he strangled one of the little girls and his wife and then put them in the water there in Oregon.
Then he went back home and loaded 4-year-old Zachary and 3-year-old Sadie into the stolen red Montana minivan and drove about 16 miles south to the bridge that crossed over the Lint Slough in Waldport. At just after 4 in the morning on December 17th, Chris pulled the van over on the bridge, tied a pillowcase full of rocks around Zachary's ankle, and threw his body into the water. He repeated the same thing with Sadie. The medical examiner confirmed that both children were alive when they went into the water.
That is crazy. To drown your children, just dump them in the water and sink them. And they were alive when this happened. I mean, what kind of psycho is this? And it's not to say that all Jehovah's Witnesses, a ton of them are criminals or anything. I know there's a lot of good ones out there. I know several that are ex-witnesses that are good. I know several that are current witnesses that are good. But it goes back to the control. If you live in a very controlling environment, it does mess with your head, and it can cause some people to lash out in very negative ways, like it did with Chris Longo. He obviously had really bad way with money, fraud, and then eventually in probably adultery, don't know that for sure. And then eventually it led him to murdering his family because they were a financial burden to him.
Last thing they saw as they looked up at that bridge that was quickly becoming smaller was their father. The person that was supposed to be there to love and protect them had just sent them to their watery graves. As the weighted pillowcases dragged them down to the bottom of the icy slough, they didn't have the time or dexterity to untie themselves, and they drowned. Then, Chris drove himself back to the condo. Not seeming to have any problem with the fact that he had just murdered his entire family, Chris stuck around Newport for a couple more days. On December 18th, he headed to Wilsonville, which was just south of Portland, Oregon, and parked the Montana in the lot of a Dodge dealership.
I'd like to know if he felt like his family was such a burden, why didn't he just leave? He could have just left them. That's what I don't understand. Same goes for Chris Watts. The story of Chris Watts is very similar to the story of Chris Longo. Chris Watts murdered his wife and 2 little girls. He strangled them. And all because he had another woman. And he wanted a new life. He didn't want any... They were having financial problems. He wanted to just be done. And I think there might have been also a life insurance policy. But it was greed and it was sex in Chris Watts' case. With Chris Longo, it was greed and narcissism. And I would also venture to say he most likely was not faithful to his wife.
He removed the license plates and strolled into the dealership. He hopped into a new green Dodge Durango, found that the keys were in the ignition since it was inside the showroom, and drove away with it. A sensor automatically opened a garage-style door that exited the showroom, and everyone on the sales floor assumed someone was taking it for a test drive. It wasn't until the next day that the employees noticed that the Durango was still gone.
So he just walks into a car dealership and takes the car? This man is bold.
Then found the Montana in their parking lot without plates and called the police. Chris would actually work 2 more shifts at the Starbucks on the morning of the 19th and 20th before fleeing the area. It's believed that Chris thought that the bodies wouldn't be discovered and planned to continue his single life in the area. He had told a friend that Mary Jane had left him, and he had told his landlord that he had taken his wife and kids to the airport, so it seemed that he was creating a reason why he was now a bachelor in the town. On December 19, 2001, the body of a young boy was found floating in the water of the Lint Slough near a local mobile home park. Police couldn't match the identity of the boy to any missing persons report, so they made a computerized drawing of the boy's face to put on the news.
It does look a lot like him.
They also identified the nearby bridge as a possible location for someone to throw a body into the water, and called in divers to search the waters under the bridge. The picture on the news got an immediate response from a woman who had become friends with the Longos and had recently babysat the kids when Chris and Mary Jane went to the movies. She identified the boy as Zachary and told authorities that they had only been in the area for a few months. The police went to the Landing condos to talk to the manager. He told them that he last saw Chris on the 17th, and he said he was taking his wife and kids to the airport. He said they were flying to Michigan. When they checked out the unit, it was discovered that the Longos had moved out. At this same time, divers located a pillowcase weighted down with rocks in the water underneath the bridge. It looked like Zachary had come untied at some point and floated to the surface. Not far away, they found the body of Sadie also tied to a pillowcase full of rocks. Their unidentified boy had turned into a double murder, but where was the rest of the family? Police were notified that 2 housekeepers at a nearby motel had found a bunch of suspicious items in the dumpster behind the building. There were baby books with pictures, Mary Jane's driver's license, children's clothes, and film that hadn't been developed. This was the same motel that the Longos had stayed in prior to moving into the condo at the Landing.
This is the problem with Chris. He is thinking in the moment. The same goes for Chris Watts, actually. The narcissistic ways. Both of them thinking in the moment and what they want at that moment. They don't think about the consequences, or they're actually really terrible at covering up their crimes because they're so self-absorbed, these kinds of people, that they end up being really bad at covering their tracks, and they get easily found out. That's their weakness.
It was quite a few days before authorities found the other 2 bodies in the case. They continued to believe that Chris and Mary Jane may have killed their 2 oldest children and fled with Madison. They found the Montana and searched it, but it didn't help them answer any of their many questions. A witness came forward and said he saw a red minivan stopped on the bridge that went over the Lintz Slough on December 17th at about 4:30 in the morning. He slowed down and asked if the man, who matched the description of Chris, needed help, but the man said everything was okay. On December 27th, divers found the 2 suitcases that contained the bodies of Mary Jane and Madison under the Embarcadero Marina. An autopsy revealed that they had both been strangled prior to being put in the water. He claimed that he picked up his paycheck Friday morning and cashed it before heading south on the freeway. When he got to San Francisco, he was going to stop there and even applied for a job at a Starbucks, but then he changed his mind. Even though Chris did seem to be trying to maintain an honest life, he still took opportunities when they came along. He had noted 4 names of young men who had recently appeared in obituaries and had written down some of the credit card numbers that he had gotten while working at the Starbucks register. After wandering the city aimlessly for a few days, Chris used the internet service at a Kinko's to book a plane ticket to Cancun, Mexico.
What kind of job can a man like that do? I mean, you can't trust him on anything.
Using one of the credit card numbers he had stolen. Even the plane ticket was booked in his name, but by the time the police knew to check flights, he was already in Mexico. After that, he could have been anywhere in the country. The manager of the San Francisco Starbucks called Chris and left him a message to come in for an interview at a specific time, but Chris never responded. The FBI were waiting to take him into custody, but it was too late. Chris was already gone. Chris was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, and the TV show America's Most Wanted did a piece about him.
How funny is that? Of course, it does make Jehovah's Witnesses look bad. But I will say, he was disfellowshipped. So, but again, it goes back to the upbringing, right? He was taught this is the truth. This is and it's control. He wanted control in every moment of his life, and it got out of hand for him.
A $50,000 reward was offered for information leading to his arrest. When Chris arrived in Cancun, he stayed in a hostel for about a week and tried to make some money, but was unsuccessful. He worked his way south, during which time he met a German photojournalist named Janina, who he told his name was Michael Finkle. Michael Finkle was a real person. He was a reporter who wrote for the New York Times Magazine, and Chris had read his work and fantasized about being a traveling writer. Chris was living his dream life as a travel writer, but in the background, his true identity was closing in. After the episode of America's Most Wanted aired on January 12, 2002, people started realizing that they had seen Christian Longo. One of the people who had stayed in the hostel in Cancun called the FBI to report her sighting of Chris, who told her first his name was Brad and then accidentally told her a different time that his name was Mike. The day after the episode aired, a tour guide in Tulum, a city about 80 miles or 130 kilometers south of Cancun, called the FBI to report seeing Chris the previous evening. The local police were brought in, and the guide showed them the campground where Chris had been staying with Janina and some other travelers. The police spotted Chris and pulled him out of the hut at gunpoint. The FBI agent asked him if he was Christian Michael Longo, and Chris answered yes. Chris did not want to spend any time in a Mexican jail. Everything Chris did was to make Chris's life more comfortable, so he...
Yeah. I mean, he's so narcissistic that he's even just, like, not even lying about his real name.
He worked out a deal that he would voluntarily return to the United States, where he would be immediately arrested by U.S. authorities. Back in Oregon, Chris wouldn't admit he killed his wife and children. When time came for him to make a plea, he pleaded guilty to 2 of the counts of murder and not guilty to the other 2 counts. Chris began claiming that he had come home from work one day and that Mary Jane had killed the 3 children.
You know who else said that? Chris Watts. Chris Watts originally said that his wife killed the 2 little girls and that he had to in turn kill her. See how these narcissistic men are? In this case, narcissistic men. Not to say all men, just these men. Very narcissistic.
In a fit of rage, he strangled Mary Jane, but afterward he realized that Madison was actually still breathing. Now, at a point of no return, he finished his youngest daughter off and disposed of all their bodies. Chris's decision was one that his lawyers advised him not to take. It was an uphill battle trying to gain sympathy with the jury, and in the end, the defense never got it. Christian Longo was found guilty of first-degree murder for both Zachary and Sadie. He was sentenced to death for the 4 murders. After Chris's arrest, the real Michael Finkle contacted the identity thief and began a sort of friendship with the man as he interviewed him. He went on to write a book about his interaction with Chris titled True Story, Murder, Memoir, Mea Culpa.
We wrote each other more than 1,000 pages of handwritten letters. We spoke on the phone 51 times. I visited with him in jail. It was a confounding relationship.
Did he confess to you?
In the very end of our relationship, after his trial, in a letter, he confessed to me that he murdered all 4 members of his family.
Why did he say he did it?
He's blamed his wife for initiating the crime, which is something that I do not believe at all. I had psychologists read some of his letters, and they diagnosed him as what's called narcissistic personality disorder.
Duh. Anybody could have seen that coming.
Extremely inflated sense of self. He thought he was very important, that his family's fortunes were diving, and that if he wasn't going to be around to take care of his family, they wouldn't be able to survive without him.
How horrified were you hearing him tell essentially his side of the story? I mean, wasn't it hard to even have a relationship with this person?
For the 1 year between Longo's impersonation and the start of his trial, we didn't discuss the crimes themselves. Longo told me his entire life story. But at the trial, in this very small courtroom, when it was apparent that Longo was guilty, and I mean, this is the most horrific crime imaginable, murdering 3 young children and your wife. Once it was obvious that Longo was guilty, the relationship fell apart.
And he's on death row now.
Deservedly so. He's on death row at the Oregon State Penitentiary.
Do you still talk to him?
For 1 year while I was writing the book, we had no contact. In recent months, there's been very superficial contact between us, just a little bit.
Years later, Christian Longo would finally admit that it was indeed him that killed all 4 of his family members.
He couldn't admit it at first, though.
He finally came to accept that he was a narcissist, and in our eyes, a monster.
Definitely, he was and is a monster. Now, he is actually in prison without the possibility of parole for life, but he is no longer on death row because he was originally sentenced to death in 2003, but then in December of 2022, Oregon Governor Kate Brown commuted the death sentences of all inmates on the state's death row, including Christian Longo to life without parole, and he has since been moved into the general prison population. The story of Christian Longo and his relationship with the journalist Michael Finkle was chronicled in Finkle's memoir, True Story, which was later adapted into a 2015 film starring James Franco as Longo and Jonah Hill as Finkle. So if you want to watch that movie, it's called True Story. Cases like this don't just ask us what happened. They ask us why no one stopped it sooner. Christian Longo didn't act in isolation. He acted in a world where image mattered more than truth, and consequences could be delayed with charm and deception. If you're a former Jehovah's Witness watching this, or a current one, and something about this story feels unsettlingly familiar, that's not weakness. That's pattern recognition. In this series, we center victims, examine systems, and speak openly about what silence protects and what it destroys. If this story mattered to you, if it made you think, or if it helped you name something you couldn't before, you're not alone. And we'll keep telling these stories until silence no longer protects the wrong people. Jehovah's Witnesses culture did not make Christian Longo a murderer, but it did shape how he understood failure, authority, and exposure. Here's how. In Jehovah's Witness culture, you don't just fail, you disgrace. If you make a major mistake, you are disgraced, you are shunned, you are reprimanded publicly. Problems aren't discussed openly. Appearances matter more than inner truth. It's all about appearances. When you go to the Kingdom Hall and, oh, brother so-and-so, elder this, and ministerial servant that, it's all about appearances and commenting and doing for the organization. But what is it like inside? Being spiritually weak carries stigma. Christian learned early, being seen as righteous matters more than being honest, giving this sense of false identity. Oh, I am a righteous person on the outside, but on the inside, I'm very dishonest. That mindset doesn't create violence, but it teaches people to hide instead of heal. You can't ever be honest. As a Jehovah's Witness male, Christian was taught he had to be the head, he had to be responsible, he had to provide, he had to lead. But there's a catch. There is no safe path to admit failure. So when he couldn't provide, he couldn't lead, he couldn't control his life, he didn't feel like a man who failed. He felt like a man who ceased to exist. Sound familiar? Disfellowshipping is framed as a loving discipline, a loving provision from Jehovah, right? But psychologically, it often produces isolation, identity collapse, humiliation, desperation. And Christian was publicly exposed, socially cut off, spiritually rejected, and privately unraveling. There was no healthy support system left for him. No therapy, no accountability, no community, just silence and shame and completely cut off. In healthy systems, confession leads to help. Consequences are painful but survivable. And in turn, you are meant to help people to improve. But in high control systems, such as JW organization, confession leads to loss of family, identity, and community, and also completely cut off and shamed, and you're not good enough. You might as well just go ahead and take your own life. I mean, that's the type of mentality that high control brings into people's minds. So in Christian's mind, exposure wasn't a step towards healing. It was total annihilation. So here's the most important part. He reached a point where he believed, if my life is over anyway, then everyone else's can be too. This is not religion. That is entitlement mixed with despair. He didn't kill because he believed in God. He killed because he believed his image mattered more than other people's lives. After the murders, he fled calmly, assumed another identity, sought admiration, contacted a journalist from prison. This tells us something crucial. He didn't see himself as evil. He saw himself as just misunderstood. That's a classic narcissistic thinking. I had reasons. You don't understand the pressure. This wasn't really my fault. Millions of Jehovah's Witnesses never harm anyone. Most people who experience shame never become violent, but Christian Longo is responsible for what he did. But cultures that punish honesty, elevate image, silence failure, and isolate the struggling can create dangerous blind spots. They don't cause monsters, but they can help hide them. And how many people have you seen where there will be a Jehovah's Witness who's shunned, who can't handle it, and they just wipe out their entire family and say, oh, it's better if they go ahead and die now because they'll be resurrected in paradise. And then maybe they take their own lives because of this sense of, I am not worthy, maybe I'm better off not being here. And that's the type of feeling that goes through your mind as a Jehovah's Witness, and any high control group will create the same type of mindset. Christian Longo didn't kill because of belief. He killed because he was taught to hide, control, and perform. And when the performance collapsed, he chose erasure over accountability. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this segment of JW True Crime. Make sure to stay tuned for more, and always remember to use your critical thinking skills when you're making decisions. We'll see you again soon.